Welcome back to our reading of Confessions by Augustine of Hippo. This is Book 6, and he writes, "Oh, you've been my hope since I was young. Where were you for me, and where had you gone? Hadn't you created me and set me apart from the animals and birds? You made me wiser, yet I walked in darkness and on unstable ground, searching for you outside of myself. But I couldn't find the God of my heart. I felt like I was in the depths of the ocean, doubting and despairing that I would ever find the truth. My mother came to me determined in her faith, following me across land and sea, trusting in you through all dangers. Even in the dangers of the sea, she comforted the sailors, who usually comfort passengers unfamiliar with the sea when they're scared, assuring them of a safe arrival because you had shown her in a vision that it would be so. She found me in a terrible state, despairing of ever finding the truth. But when I told her that I was no longer a Manichee, though not yet a Catholic Christian, she wasn't overexcited, as if it was something unexpected. She was relieved about that part of my misery, which she had mourned over as if I were dead, but hoped to be revived by you. She imagined carrying me on the stretcher of her thoughts, so you could say to the son of the widow, 'Young man, I say to you, get up.' And he would come back to life, start speaking, and you would give him back to his mother. Her heart wasn't wildly thrilled when she heard that what she prayed for daily with tears was already partly realized, that even though I hadn't found the truth yet, I was free from falsehood. But she was confident that you, who had promised everything, would one day give the rest. So she calmly and confidently told me, 'I believe in Christ, that before I die, I will see you a Catholic believer.' That's what she said to me. But to you, the source of all mercy, she prayed even more fervently and shed more tears, asking you to hurry your help and light up my darkness. She rushed to the church even more eagerly and listened to Ambrose, praying for the source of the water that springs up to eternal life. She loved that man like an angel from God, because she knew that he had brought me to this uncertain state of faith I was in. She was confident that I would move from illness to health after a severe crisis, which doctors called the crisis. So my mom had this habit back in Africa where she'd bring cakes, bread, and wine to the churches built in honor of the saints. But one day the doorkeeper told her that the bishop had forbidden this. As soon as she heard this, she immediately respected his wishes. I was actually surprised at how quickly she criticized her own actions instead of questioning his ban. She wasn't a heavy drinker or anything. She didn't let her love for wine cloud her judgment or make her despise her truth like some people I know. These folks get so defensive when you suggest they should drink less, as if you're trying to water down their booze. But my mom, she'd bring her basket of festival food, have a taste, and then give it away. She'd only have one small cup of wine, watered down to her liking, and she'd take a sip out of courtesy. If she had to honor several churches of the saints, she'd still carry around that same cup to use everywhere. Even if the wine became watery and unpleasantly warm from being carried around, she'd share it with those around her in small sips. She was there for devotion, not pleasure. So when she found out that this famous preacher and very religious bishop had forbidden even this modest custom to prevent people from getting drunk, she was more than happy to stop. She realized that these annual ceremonies were starting to resemble pagan superstitions. Instead, she started bringing a heart full of sincere prayers to the churches of the martyrs and giving what she could to the poor. That way, the Lord's body could be properly celebrated where the martyrs had been sacrificed and crowned. But I thank God that maybe she wouldn't have given up this tradition so easily if someone else had told her to. She had a lot of respect for Ambrose because of how much he had done for my salvation. He also had a lot of respect for her because of her religious devotion and her constant presence in the church. Whenever he saw me, he'd always praise her and tell me how lucky I was to have such a mother. Little did he know I was questioning everything, and I wasn't sure if the path to life could ever be found. I hadn't yet reached the point where I was praying for your help. Instead, I was completely focused on learning and debating. I admired Ambrose, who was considered successful by worldly standards. He was highly respected by influential people, which made me think he was fortunate. The only thing I found hard to understand was his choice to remain celibate. However, I had no idea about the hopes he held within him, the battles he fought against temptations, how he found comfort in tough times, or the joy he derived from your teachings, which he quietly contemplated. I couldn't guess or relate to any of these experiences. He also didn't know about my emotional turmoil or the danger I was in. I couldn't ask him what I wanted to because he was always surrounded by a crowd of people asking his help. When he wasn't with them, which was rare, he was either just eating just enough to keep his strength up or reading to stimulate his mind. When he read, his eyes would scan the pages while his heart sought to understand the meaning, but he would remain silent. Often we would find him reading quietly to himself. No one was ever turned away from his presence, and he didn't require anyone to announce their arrival. We would sit silently, not daring to interrupt him, and eventually leave. We guessed that he didn't want to be disturbed during the little free time he had away from others' demands, which he used to refresh his mind. Perhaps he was worried that if he came across something difficult in his reading, someone might ask him to explain it or discuss the complex issues. This would take up his time and prevent him from reading as much as he wanted to. Maybe he read silently to preserve his voice, which could easily be strained by too much talking. Whatever his reasons, it was clear that this practice was beneficial for someone like him. I never really had the chance to ask what I wanted from that holy source of wisdom, his heart, unless it could be answered quickly. But the questions I had, which needed his full attention, never got the time they required. I did listen to him every Sunday, explaining the truth of the word to the people, and I became more and more convinced that all the tricky arguments that our deceivers had made against the divine books could be untangled. But when I also understood that man created by you in your own image was not interpreted by your spiritual children, who you have reborn through grace from the Catholic Mother, as if they thought of you as having a human form, even though I had no clear idea of what a spiritual substance might be, I felt relieved and embarrassed that for so many years I had been arguing not against the Catholic faith, but against the fantasies of physical imaginations. I had been so reckless and disrespectful that instead of trying to learn through questioning, I had made judgments and condemnations. You, the most high and closest, the most hidden yet most present, who are not made up of different sized parts but are entirely everywhere and nowhere in space, are not of a physical shape, yet you have created man in your own image. And look, from head to foot, he is contained in space. I didn't understand how your image could exist, so I should have asked and expressed my doubts about how it could be believed, rather than rudely opposing it as if I believed it. My doubts about what was certain gnawed at me more intensely, and I felt ashamed that I had been fooled for so long by the promise of certainties. I had passionately spoken about so many uncertainties with a childlike mistake. It became clear to me later that these were all lies. But I was sure that they were uncertain, and that I had previously considered them certain. I had blindly criticized your Catholic Church, which I now realize didn't teach the things I had harshly criticized it for. This realization left me feeling embarrassed but also transformed. I was overjoyed, my God, that the one and only church, the body of your only Son, where I was named as a Christian when I was a baby, didn't entertain childish ideas. In her sound teaching, she didn't maintain any belief that would limit you, the Creator of all, to a space, no matter how big or vast, yet confined by the boundaries of a human form. I was also glad that the old scriptures of the law and the prophets were presented to me. They didn't seem ridiculous anymore, like they did when I was used to criticize your holy ones for their beliefs, even though they didn't actually think that way. I was happy to hear Ambrose often emphasize this saying in his sermons to the people, "The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life." He would interpret the hidden spiritual meanings of the scriptures, which seemed to teach something flawed if taken literally. He didn't teach anything that upset me, even though he taught things I wasn't sure were true. I was careful not to agree with anything too quickly, fearing I might make a mistake. But this cautiousness only made things worse. I wanted to be as sure of the things I couldn't see as I was that 7 plus 3 equals 10. I wasn't crazy enough to think that even this could be understood, but I wanted other things to be as clear as this, whether they were physical things that weren't present to my senses, or spiritual things that I didn't know how to imagine except in physical terms. If I had believed, I could have been healed. Then the vision of my soul might have been cleared up in some way and directed toward your truth, which always remains and never fails. But just as someone who's had a bad experience with a doctor might be afraid to trust a good one, so it was with the health of my soul. It could only be healed by believing, but it was afraid to believe falsehoods, so it refused to be healed. It resisted your hands, which have prepared the medicines of faith, and applied them to the diseases of the whole world, giving them such great authority. When I started leaning towards Catholicism, I appreciated its straightforward and honest approach. It didn't claim to have all the answers, but asked for faith in things that couldn't always be proven. This was different from the Manichees, who promised certain knowledge, but then expected us to believe in a bunch of absurd and fantastical things that couldn't be proven. Then, God, you gently and compassionately started to change my heart. You made me realize how many things I believed in without seeing or experiencing them firsthand. I believed in historical events, places and cities I'd never visited, friends, doctors, and countless other people. If I didn't trust in these things, I wouldn't be able to function in life. I even believed in who my parents were based on what I was told. Considering all of this, you convinced me that the people who didn't believe in your scriptures, which are respected by almost all nations, were the ones in the wrong. Those who questioned me, asking, "How do you know that these scriptures were given to humanity by the Spirit of the one true God?" shouldn't be listened to. This belief was the most important of all. Despite all the contradictory philosophies I'd read, nothing could shake my belief that you exist and you govern human affairs, even though I didn't fully understand what that meant. I've always believed, sometimes more strongly than others, that you exist and that you care for us. However, I didn't know what to think about your nature or how to find my way to you. We were too weak to discover the truth through abstract reasoning, which is why we needed the authority of the Holy Scriptures. I had started to believe that you wouldn't have given such authority to the Scriptures in all the lands if you didn't want us to believe in you and seek you through them. Before, there were things in the Scriptures that seemed strange and bothered me. But after hearing various explanations, I realized that these were deep mysteries. The authority of the Scriptures seemed even more respectable and worthy of religious belief to me because, while anyone could read them, they kept the majesty of their mysteries hidden within their deeper meanings. They were accessible to all because of their simple words and humble style, but they required intense focus from those who weren't light-hearted. This way, the Scriptures could welcome everyone, but only guide a few, yet still more than if they didn't have such authority or didn't attract so many with their humble nature towards you. I pondered these things, and you were with me. I sighed, and you heard me. I was uncertain, and you guided me. I wandered through the wide world, and you never left me. I was chasing after recognition, wealth, and marriage, and you, God, laughed at all my pursuits. In these desires I faced severe disappointments. The kinder you were to me, the less you allowed anything that wasn't you to bring me joy. Look at my heart, Lord. You want me to remember all this and confess to you. Let my soul stick to you now that you've freed it from the sticky trap of death. How miserable was I! You intensified the pain of my wounds so that I would abandon everything else and turn to you, who are above all. Without you, everything would be meaningless. Turn to you and be healed. How miserable I was then, and how you dealt with me, making me feel my misery on that day when I was preparing to praise the emperor with a speech full of lies. I was going to be applauded by those who knew I was lying. My heart was racing with anxiety and boiling with feverish thoughts. And as I was walking down a street in Milan, I saw a poor, happy, and joking beggar, probably with a full belly. I sighed and talked to my friends about the many troubles we put ourselves through. I was struggling under the weight of my own misery, driven by desire, and making it worse. All we had hoped to achieve was the kind of happiness that the beggar already had, and he might never reach it again. What he got from a few begged pennies, I was striving for through a lot of hard work, the joy of temporary happiness. He didn't have true joy, but the joy I was seeking through my ambitious plans was even less real. He was happy. I was anxious. He was carefree. I was full of fears. But if someone asked me if I'd rather be happy or afraid, I'd choose to be happy. If they asked if I'd rather be like the beggar or like I was then, I'd choose to be myself despite my worries and fears. But that was a wrong judgment. I shouldn't have considered myself better than him just because I was more educated, especially since I didn't find any joy in it. I was trying to please people, not educate them. That's why you, God, punished me. Get rid of those people from my life who tell me it matters where a man's joy comes from. That beggar found joy in drunkenness. You sought joy in glory. What glory, Lord? The kind that doesn't come from you. Just like his joy wasn't real, that glory wasn't real either, and it messed me up even more. He could sleep off his drunkenness in one night, but I woke up with my false glory, went to sleep with it, and woke up with it again, day after day. Only you, God, know for how long. But it does matter where a man's joy comes from. I get it, and the joy of a faithful hope is incomparably better than such emptiness. Yes, and at that time he was better off than me. He was genuinely happier, not only because he was soaked in joy while I was torn apart by worries, but he, with honest desires, had gotten wine. I, through deceit, was chasing after empty, inflated praise. I often shared these thoughts with my friends, and I frequently noticed how things were going for me through their reactions, and I realized things were not going well, and that made me feel even worse. And if any good fortune came my way, I was hesitant to grab it, because almost before I could hold on to it, it slipped away. My friends and I, who were living closely together, often lamented about these issues, but I mostly discussed them with Alypius and Nebridius. Alypius was from my hometown and was of high social standing there, but he was younger than me. He had been my student both when I first started teaching in our town and later in Carthage. He had a great affection for me because he thought I was kind and knowledgeable, and I admired him for his strong inclination towards virtue, which was quite remarkable for someone his age. However, the lifestyle of Carthage, especially its obsession with frivolous spectacles, had sucked him into the madness of the circus. He was struggling with this addiction while I was teaching rhetoric there at a public school. However, due to some disagreement between his father and me, he didn't attend my classes. I realized how infatuated he was with the circus, and it deeply saddened me. He seemed to be wasting his potential, and I felt helpless. I couldn't advise him or persuade him to change his ways, neither as a friend nor as a teacher. I assumed he shared his father's negative opinion of me, but he proved me wrong. He set aside his father's views and started to approach me. He would occasionally drop by my lecture room, listen for a bit, and then leave. I had forgotten to guide him so he wouldn't fall victim to pointless distractions despite his sharp mind. But you, Lord, who guides all your creations, hadn't forgotten him. He was destined to be one of your children, a priest and dispenser of your sacraments. You used me without my knowledge to bring about this change, so it would be clear that it was your doing. One day I was teaching my students. He walked in, greeted me, sat down, and focused on the topic I was discussing. I happened to be explaining a passage that reminded me of the circus races, a comparison I thought would make my point clearer and more engaging, while also mocking those who were obsessed with such frivolities. God, you know I wasn't thinking of curing Alypius of his obsession at that time. But he took my words to heart, thinking I was speaking directly to him. Where others might have taken offense, this wise young man took it as a reason to self-reflect and appreciate me even more. As you have said in your book, rebuke a wise man and he will love you. But I hadn't rebuked him. It was you using me, knowingly or not, to ignite his hopeful mind and cure it. Anyone who does not acknowledge your mercies should remain silent in your praise. I confess to you from the depths of my soul. Because of my words, he managed to escape the deep pit of his obsession with the circus games. He took control of his mind, shook off the filth of these games, and never returned to them. After this, he convinced his reluctant father to let him become my student. His father agreed, and Alypius started attending my classes again. He fell into the same beliefs as me, admiring the apparent self-control of the Manichees, thinking it was genuine. But it was a deceptive and empty self-control, trapping precious souls who were not yet able to understand true virtue, easily fooled by the appearance of what was merely a fake virtue. He didn't abandon the secular path his parents had encouraged him to follow. Instead, he went to Rome before me to study law. There he became incredibly obsessed with gladiator shows. Despite his strong dislike and distaste for such spectacles, he was one day unexpectedly met by some of his friends and fellow students coming from dinner. They forcefully dragged him, despite his vehement refusal and resistance, into the amphitheater during these brutal and deadly shows. He protested, "Even if you drag my body to that place and make me sit there, can you force me to pay attention or watch those shows? I'll be physically present, but mentally absent, and in doing so, I'll defeat both you and the show." Despite hearing this, his friends still took him along, perhaps wanting to test whether he could actually do as he claimed. Once they arrived and found their seats, the whole place was ignited with the barbaric entertainment. But he, shutting his eyes, refused to let his mind wander towards such evil. He wished he could have blocked his ears, too. During the fight, when one gladiator fell, a huge roar from the crowd struck him hard. Overcome by curiosity and thinking he could handle whatever he saw, he opened his eyes. The sight wounded his soul deeper than the fallen gladiator's physical wounds. He was more devastated than the fallen gladiator, whose fall had caused a loud noise that had pierced his ears and prompted him to open his eyes. This led to the downfall of his soul, which was more bold and resolute, and weaker because it relied on itself instead of you. As soon as he saw the blood, he was consumed by savagery. He didn't look away, but instead stared, drinking in the madness unknowingly. He was thrilled by the violent spectacle and was intoxicated by the bloodshed. He was no longer the man he was when he arrived, but had become one of the crowd, a true companion of those who had brought him there. Need I say more? He watched, he cheered, he was inflamed, and he left with a madness that would drive him to not only return with those who first brought him there, but also to arrive before them and even bring others along. Yet you, with your strong and merciful hand, pulled him out of this and taught him to rely not on himself but on you. But that was later. But this was already being stored in his memory to be a lesson for the future. So was this incident when he was still studying under me in Carthage. He was in the marketplace at noon rehearsing what he had to memorize, as students often do, when you allowed him to be mistaken for a thief by the market officials. I believe, our God, you allowed this to happen for a reason. You wanted him, who was destined to become a great man, to start learning that people shouldn't be too quick to judge others based on assumptions. He was walking back and forth alone in front of the judge's bench with his notebook and his pen, when a young man, a lawyer, who was the actual thief, sneaked in unnoticed by Alypius. He reached the lead grates that protect the silversmith's shops and started to cut through the lead. But the sound of the hatchet alerted the silversmiths below. They started to make a fuss and sent people to catch whoever they could find. The thief, hearing their voices, ran away, leaving the hatchet behind, afraid of being caught with it. Alypius, who hadn't seen him enter, noticed him leaving and saw how quickly he ran off. Curious about what was happening, Alypius went into the shop and found the hatchet. He was standing there holding it and wondering about it. When the people who had been sent arrived, they found him alone with a hatchet in his hand, the noise of which had alerted them and brought them there. They grabbed him, dragged him away, and gathered the people in the marketplace, bragging about catching a notorious thief. And so he was being led away to be taken before the judge. Alypius was about to learn a valuable lesson. You see, Lord, you were the only one who knew the truth about his innocence. As he was being taken away, either to jail or to face punishment, they ran into a certain architect. This guy was in charge of all the public buildings. They were actually glad to see him, as they were often suspected of stealing stuff from the marketplace. They thought they could finally show him who the real thief was. This architect had seen Alypius a few times at a senator's house, where Alypius often went to visit. Recognizing him, the architect pulled him aside, asked what was going on, and heard the whole story. Amidst all the chaos and threats, he told everyone to follow him. They ended up at the house of a young man who had actually committed the crime. Outside the house, there was a young boy who, not realizing the trouble his master was in, would likely spill the beans. He had been with his master at the marketplace that day. As soon as Alypius recognized him, he told the architect. The architect showed the boy the hatchet and asked him, "Whose is this?" The boy quickly replied, "It's ours." And under further questioning, he revealed everything. So the blame was shifted to the right house, and the crowd, which had been ready to condemn Alypius, was left feeling pretty embarrassed. Alypius, who was destined to be a preacher of your word and a judge of many cases in your church, walked away from the whole ordeal wiser and better prepared. I first met him in Rome, and we quickly became inseparable. He followed me to Milan, partly because he didn't want to leave me, and partly to practice some law which he had studied more to please his parents than himself. In Milan, he had served 3 times as a judge, impressing everyone with his incorruptibility. He was surprised that others could prioritize money over honesty. His character was tested not only by the lure of greed, but also by the sting of fear. In Rome, he had been a judge for the Italian treasury. At that time, there was a very influential senator who many people owed favors to, and many feared. This senator tried to use his power to get something that was not legally allowed. Alypius stood up to him. He was offered a bribe, but he rejected it with all his heart. Threats were made, but he shrugged them off. Everyone was amazed by his unusual courage, which neither sought the friendship nor feared the hostility of such a powerful person, known for his ability to do good or harm. Even the judge, whom Alypius advised, didn't openly refuse the senator's request. Instead, he put the responsibility on Alypius, claiming that he wouldn't allow him to do it. Because if the judge had done it, Alypius would have ruled differently. The only thing that almost tempted him was the opportunity to have books copied for him at a discounted price. But he chose to uphold justice, considering the fairness that held him back more beneficial than the power that allowed him. These might seem like small things, but to someone who is trustworthy in small matters, is also trustworthy in larger ones. The truth of your words can't be denied. If you have not been faithful in handling worldly wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you've not been faithful with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? At that time, Alypius was very close to me, and together we were certain about what path in life to take. Nebridius also, who had left his hometown near Carthage, and even Carthage itself where he had spent lots of time, left behind his impressive family estate, his house, and his mother, who wasn't going to join him. He had come to Milan for one reason only, to join me in our passionate quest for truth and wisdom. He was just like me, full of sighs and doubts, a fervent seeker of the true meaning of life, and a sharp analyst of the most complex issues. So there we were, 3 broke guys, sharing our struggles with each other and relying on you to provide for us when the time was right. And in all the hardship that your mercy allowed us to experience in our worldly affairs, we were left in the dark about why we had to go through all of this. We would often turn away, groaning and asking, "How long will this go on?" We asked this question a lot, but even as we did, we didn't give up on our worldly affairs, because nothing certain had yet emerged that we could hold on to once we let go of them. Looking back on my life, I was amazed at how much time had passed since I was 19 when I first started seeking wisdom. I had decided then to let go of all the empty promises and deceptive desires. But here I was at 30, still stuck in the same rut, chasing after fleeting pleasures that only drained my soul. I kept telling myself, tomorrow I'll find what I'm looking for. It'll become clear and I'll be able to grasp it. Faustus the Machinee will come and explain everything. I thought to myself, so it's true what you great scholars, you academics say, that there's no certainty in life? But I refused to give up. I decided to search even more diligently. The things in the religious texts that once seemed absurd to me now made sense, or could be interpreted in a good way. I decided to stick with the faith of my childhood until I found the truth. But where and when would I find it? Ambrose was always busy. I didn't have time to read. Where would I even find the books? How and when could I get them? Who could I borrow them from? I decided to set aside specific times for the well-being of my soul. I felt a new hope. The Catholic faith wasn't what I thought it was, and I had wrongly accused it. Its followers didn't believe that God was confined to a human form, so why not knock so the rest may be opened? My mornings were taken up by my students. What should I do then with the rest of my time? Why not devote it to this quest? But then, when would I have time to network with influential friends whose favor I needed? When would I write the material to sell to my students? When would I take a break and relax my mind from all these intense concerns? Let's stop worrying about pointless things and focus on finding the truth. Life is unpredictable and death is uncertain. If it comes suddenly, are we prepared? What happens to the things we didn't learn here? Will we be punished for our ignorance? What if death is the end of all care and feeling? We need to find out, but God forbid. The Christian faith isn't meaningless or empty. It has spread all over the world. God wouldn't have done so much for us if our souls died with our bodies. So why are we hesitating to let go of worldly hopes and fully commit to seeking God and a blessed life? But hold on. Worldly things are enjoyable. They have a certain sweetness. We shouldn't give up on them easily because it would be embarrassing to go back to them. Look, it's not a big deal to achieve some status, and then what more could we want? We have a lot of influential friends. If nothing else comes up and we're in a hurry, we could at least get a presidency. And a wife with some money so she doesn't increase our expenses. And this should be the limit of our desires. Many great men worthy of emulation have pursued wisdom while being married. As I pondered these things, and as my emotions were tossed around by varying winds, time kept moving forward. Yet I hesitated to turn to God. I kept putting off living in His presence, but didn't hesitate to self-destruct daily. I yearned for a happy life, but I was afraid of it in its true form, and paradoxically, I tried to find it by running away from it. I believed that I would be too miserable without the comfort of a woman's embrace. I didn't consider the healing power of God's mercy for this weakness simply because I hadn't experienced it. As for self-control, I assumed it was something we could achieve on our own. But in my own experience, I didn't find that strength. I was naive enough to not understand the written words. No one can have self-control unless you grant it. I didn't realize that you would grant it if I sincerely pleaded with you and entrusted my worries to you with unwavering faith. Alypius was the one who discouraged me from getting married. He argued that if I did, we wouldn't be able to fully dedicate our time to our shared love of wisdom, something we both had longed for. Alypius himself was incredibly disciplined in this regard, which was quite impressive, especially considering his young age. He had started on this path early on, but hadn't always been consistent. However, he had felt guilty about it and decided to live a more disciplined life from then on. I disagreed with him, citing examples of married men who had successfully balanced their love for wisdom, their service to God, their friendships, and their marital obligations. However, I had to admit that I lacked their strength of character. I was enslaved by my physical desires and their deadly allure. I was afraid to break free from these chains and resisted Alypius's advice as if it were a threat to my comfort. Moreover, I became a bad influence on Alypius. I used my words to create enticing traps for him, hoping to ensnare his virtuous and independent spirit. He was surprised that I, someone he held in high regard, was so caught up in the allure of pleasure that I insisted, every time we talked about it, that I could never live a single life. When he expressed his surprise, I defended myself by saying there was a big difference between his fleeting and barely remembered experience of that life, which he could easily dismiss, and my ongoing acquaintance with it. I argued that if you added the respectable title of marriage to it, he shouldn't be surprised that I couldn't dismiss that lifestyle. This made him start to consider getting married himself, not because he was overwhelmed with desire for such pleasure, but out of curiosity. He wanted to understand, he said, what this thing was that, without it, my life, which he found so appealing, would seem to me to not be a life, but a punishment. His mind, free from that constraint, was baffled by my enslavement, and through that bafflement he was developing a desire to try it, which could lead to the actual trial, and perhaps even to falling into the same trap he was surprised by. He was willing to make a pact with death, and as the saying goes, he who loves danger will fall into it. The honor that comes with managing a married life and a family didn't really motivate us, but for the most part, I was tormented by the habit of satisfying an insatiable appetite, while it held me captive. He, on the other hand, was being led captive by a sense of awe and wonder. That was our situation until you, O Most High, not abandoning our human frailty, took pity on our misery and came to our aid in mysterious and hidden ways. There was a constant push to get me married. I courted, I was promised, largely due to my mother's efforts, that once I was married, the purifying act of baptism could cleanse me. She was thrilled to see me getting ready for this, noticing that her prayers and your promises were being fulfilled through my faith. During this time, both at my request and her own desire, she fervently prayed to you every day, asking you to reveal something about my future marriage through a vision. But you never did. She did see some vague and fanciful things, the kind that the human mind can conjure up when it's preoccupied. She shared these with me, but not with the same confidence she usually had when you showed her something. She dismissed them. She claimed she could tell the difference between your revelations and the dreams of her own mind through a certain feeling she couldn't put into words. Still, the marriage issue was pushed forward, and a girl 2 years younger than the appropriate age was proposed for marriage. She was deemed suitable, so we waited for her. A bunch of us friends, tired of the chaos and stress of everyday life, had been discussing, and we were pretty much decided on stepping away from the hustle and bustle. Our plan was to pool our resources and live together as one big household. The idea was that our strong friendship would mean that no one would claim anything as their own. Everything would belong to everyone. We thought there might be about 10 of us in this group, including our wealthy friend Romanius. He was really keen on this idea, and his opinion carried a lot of weight because he had more money than the rest of us. We also decided that we'd have 2 people in charge each year to handle all the necessary stuff, so the rest of us could chill out. But when we started to think about whether our wives, or our future wives for some of us, would be okay with this, our well-thought-out plan just fell apart. So we ended up sighing, groaning, and just going back to our normal lives, following the same old path that everyone else does. We had so many ideas, but in the end, your plan is the one that stands firm. You laughed at our plans, and you had your own in mind. You intended to provide for us in your own time and to fill our souls with blessings. Meanwhile, my mistakes were piling up. My lover was taken away from me because she was seen as an obstacle to my marriage. My heart, which was so attached to her, was torn, wounded, and bleeding. She went back to Africa, promising to God that she would never be with another man, and left our son with me. But I, in my misery, couldn't even match the resolve of a woman. I was impatient, and I couldn't wait for 2 years to marry the woman I wanted. It wasn't so much about marriage, but more about my lustful desires. So I found another woman, not a wife, to keep feeding the sickness of my soul with the enduring habit of lust, hoping it would carry into my marriage. But my wound from losing my first love wasn't healed. After a lot of pain and inflammation, it became numb, and my pain became less intense, but more hopeless. Praise and glory to you, the source of all mercy. I was sinking deeper into misery, but you were always there, ready to pull me out of the muck and cleanse me. I didn't realize it then. The only thing that kept me from diving deeper into worldly pleasures was the fear of death and your impending judgment. This fear never left me even as I changed. During discussions with my friends Alypius and Nebridius about the nature of good and evil, I was inclined to agree with Epicurus' philosophy, but I couldn't fully accept it because I believed in life after death and that people are rewarded or punished based on their actions, something Epicurus didn't believe in. I wondered, if we were immortal and could live forever in physical pleasure without the fear of losing it, wouldn't we be happy? What else would we need? I didn't realize then how miserable this very thought was. I was so lost and blinded that I couldn't see the true beauty and excellence that should be pursued for its own sake. This beauty is invisible to the physical eye, but it can be seen by the inner self. In my ignorance, I didn't consider where my joy in discussing even these flawed ideas with my friends came from. Even by my own standards of happiness at the time, I knew I couldn't be truly happy without friends, no matter how many worldly pleasures I had. I loved my friends for who they were, and I felt their love for me in return. Oh, what twisted paths we take. It's a tragedy for the bold soul that thought it could abandon you and find something better. It's tried every which way, back, sides, and belly, but it's all been painful. You're the only source of peace. And look, you're right here, ready to rescue us from our miserable detours and put us back on your path. You comfort us and say, "Run, I will carry you. Yes, I will see you through. I will also carry you there." That is the end of this chapter. See you in the next one.